Good day, everyone. My name is DM Rawlings, the 10-Minute DM. I am an experienced Forge in the Dark GM, and I am here to offer some advice to you, 10 minutes at a time. So today we're going to talk about marks and harm. So to get started here, what is harm? Harm is damage, and it comes in 3 different flavors. There's body, which is physical injuries like cuts and scrapes. There's brain harm, which is mental impediments like stuns and headaches. And there's bleed, like magical afflictions, corruption, contamination, that kind of thing. It's really all there is to it. Pretty straightforward. Some examples with some varying stakes. First off, medium stakes. The medallion hums with arcane power, but something is wrong. Marley suffers 1 bleed. The dagger digs into Taylor's side, and blood spills. They take 1 body. Riley connects with the creature. Its intellect is immense. They mark 1 brain. Or high stakes. The beast grips Ren by the shoulder with its trunk-like arm. They are trapped in its vice-like grip, taking a body. The farmer discharges his shotgun at close range into Dallas's chest. They take body from the rock salt, and a brain from the agonizing pain. Noel attunes to the cursed scepter, and they immediately feel an otherworldly touch. Noel suffers a bleed, and they feel a discharge of energy as the curse extends to them. But what about low stakes? I thought about this a bit, and after that thought, I believe we should only be giving temporary marks for low stakes rolls, as compared to the permanent ones that we get from medium and above. So what do I mean by temporary? You likely know. It's still a mark, but it goes away after the character rests or gets some treatment. This is an alright way to create tension and limit it just to the single scene. Once they've received care, just remove the mark and move on. Or if they have some gap of time where they can dress a wound or get some refreshments to refresh their mind. Well, what about cases where there's success versus case where there's success with failure? And I mean a 4 to 5 result versus a 1 to 3. Well, in my mind, there's not really much of a difference between the two. The fictional basis for either is pretty interchangeable, if we're being honest. Someone gets hurt, and the only difference is whether they succeed or not. And that's really it. So, applying harm. I thought it might be beneficial to give you a rubric for harm. Like, what kind of harm should we be dealing out in any given circumstance? When the stakes are low, there's no harm or temporary harm. When the stakes are medium, we're going to apply 1 mark, maybe a minor complication. And if the stakes are high, maybe we're giving 1 mark plus a major complication, or we're giving 2 different mark types rather than 2 at the same time. I feel like 2 body marks is often going to be too much for a standard game. But obviously, if your players are expecting a more deadly game, then go ahead and up this. Just like Chapter 2 of Candela Obscura, it is perfectly okay to vary this based on the individual table. And we will have the book within a month or so, which means that we can compare the guidance that I'm giving today versus what is actually going to be in the Candela Obscura main book. I expect it's going to be pretty similar. And the reason that I mentioned these levels is because we are playing a long game here, right? Candela Obscura is designed for campaigns that are somewhere between 8 and 12 sessions. And unless your players are reckless, you're not really going to expect them to mark a scar in the very first session that they have. The characters have limited options for recovery, though, and as time passes, as attrition builds up, the characters are going to be at risk, and they're going to be taking scars or at the verge of taking scars, despite their best effort. Something important about GMing in general, but I think becomes relevant here, is the role of referee at the table. I used to be a referee for lacrosse games when I was younger, and I would often astonish people when I told them that most of the time I had no idea what the score of the game was. The score wasn't really my business. For me, the most important things were player safety first, and then calling a fair game. If I knew the score, would that maybe have affected my call? And that's why I think in tabletop games, it's good practice to be indifferent to the situation that the characters are in. So, how much harm they have? Probably not worth knowing. Don't look at character sheets to find out. Instead, let the fiction of the moment play out, and apply harm if you think that it feels right. Players are the best arbiter of how much risk they're willing to expose their characters to. And as GMs, we should aspire to perceive the fiction as it lies, and then apply fair consequences based on that, rather than playing around the hard mechanics of the game. Again, your players are going to be more invested in that, and that's perfectly fine. Some observations about harm. The first is, in Blades in the Dark, there are harm boxes that you physically fill out with descriptions of your injury, like broken leg or whatever. And in the future, if that kind of injury would cause you some kind of inhibition, then you suffer a penalty on that roll. Candela Obscura doesn't do this, but I do think it's okay to bring in minor parts of some of their previous marks, so long as it fits the fiction. Perhaps an injury changes the stakes. It would have been normal stakes, but now it's high stakes. A character's blood-soaked dress makes a social role much more desperate than it was before. Or maybe a character's been scented by bleed, and the monster is ravenous and wants it. Or maybe, in extreme situations, you would allow a previous injury mark to remove a die. Maybe you specifically described a character's leg getting hurt, and now they're trying to run away from something. Or you described a haze of the mind because of a brain scar, and now a character is trying to do something that has heavy focus. These are situations where I think you can get into that a little bit, again, when it fits the fiction. And I wanted to make 2 points about scars. This is about harm, but scars are the inevitable outcome of harm. So the first thing that I want to say is we should be very descriptive about the harm that we give. The better the detail, the better the prompt it is. When a player gains a scar, they'll be able to do something way, way cooler with the scar if they have better context around it. So we should be answering the 5 W's. What caused the injury? Where did they get hurt? What was it in particular that happened to them? And how does the mark affect them? Right? These are all questions that let our players bring that to the next level and maybe cause a Robbie situation. Who's to say? And the second point that I wanted to bring up about scars is that getting knocked out should swing the fiction against the characters. Suddenly the action economy is compromised and a character is vulnerable. Players should have to push harder and spend more of their character's resources to break even. In both Chapter 1 and Chapter 2 on the main channel, I found that the GMs were very lenient on when characters came back into consciousness. But come on, Candela Obscura is a horror game. Attrition is expected, and it's an opportunity to really tighten the screws on the players and make the rubber hit the road. Make them sweat, make them struggle, make them suffer for it, because the more that they do, the happier they're going to feel when they get through it, or they wipe. And also, some really quick advice when you're doing your prep for sessions. Come up with a few different ways that the monster might hurt the characters. Mix up your physical, mental, and supernatural harm possibilities, and then take that moment to crank up how awful they are. It is a monster from outside time and space, after all. And then have it on hand so that it's ready to dole out, and you can disturb your players with it later. Just prep how the monster can hurt people. I think that's a really cool way to do that. And then the last thing that I want to mention about harm is, in my opinion, it is the least interesting consequence of all of the different ones that are out there. In Candela Obscura, harm is pretty easy to ignore until you can't ignore it anymore, right? There's no intrinsic penalties to marks, although I did discuss some ways that you might want to bring that in. So it can feel like those marks are inconsequential. And often it doesn't feel like the fiction is moving forward if there's no reaction from the players about the injury. Instead, unless the consequence is screaming that harm is the right way to do it, and that happens quite often, I do strongly recommend doling out other consequences instead. If you're in a pinch, fall back to harm as a last resort, but if you can crank up the tension in another way, try doing that instead. in many ways, what you're doing here is seeding the future with more opportunities for harm and making it more difficult for them. So, lastly, using harm. When do we want to use harm? Well, maybe we want to follow the fiction when a character puts themselves in harm's way and we want to follow through. Maybe we want to increase the tension for a character who's already beat up a little bit. Or maybe you just want to apply a consequence, but nothing else is really leaping out at you. Okay, well that's harm taken care of. I'm actually surprised at how much I had to say about it. But I've been DM Rawlings, the 10-Minute DM, and if you like what you see, hit the subscribe button. Thank you so much.